You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello, welcome to Campus Talks, the podcast in which we seek advice and insight to support those in higher education. I'm your host, Miranda Prynne, campus editor, and today we are focused on the arts and humanities and the value these bring to students and to wider society, or more specifically, why it is that the value of these disciplines is so often overlooked or misunderstood, and how academics and others engaged in the arts and humanities can communicate and demonstrate their worth. None of this is new. Arguments about the value of arts and humanities have been raging since time immemorial, but what is also probably true is that the loudest critics of these disciplines do not tend to come from within the academy itself, but from politicians, policy bods, and the media. These criticisms are often based on rather blunt statistical judgments, such as graduate earnings. Often these are slightly lower on average for arts and humanities than for STEM graduates, but can this really be seen as an accurate measure of job fulfilment and success? Perhaps the reason few within the academy itself tend to lambast the arts and humanities is because they recognise the huge value the skills underpinned by many of these subjects bring. The arts and humanities help us unpick how we understand the world and thus are often central to moving innovation and discovery from the lab into the world. But there is a lot more to why we should be studying, supporting and funding the arts and humanities, as we are about to hear from two UK academics personally invested in these disciplines. My colleague Eliza spoke to Mark Power, the Vice-Chancellor and Chief Executive of Liverpool John Moores University and a Professor of Higher Education Leadership, but also a practising artist with a background in fine art. Remarkably, Mark has now worked at John Moores University for 44 years, having taken up a role in the fine art department in what was then Liverpool Polytechnic in 1981. But he has maintained his work as an artist alongside his university career throughout this time and still shares a studio with his wife. Eliza asked what skills his background as an artist he has been able to bring to his university work and how the two complement. They also discussed the wider question of what arts and humanities graduates bring to the workplace and what happens when the arts and humanities meet STEM in a bountiful union. I spoke to Michael Scott, Pro Vice-Chancellor International and a Professor of Classics and Ancient History at the University of Warwick. Michael's own research uses interdisciplinary approaches to analyse evidence about ancient Greek and Roman society. But as a passionate proponent of wider public engagement and outreach, he has also written a number of books aimed at bringing the ancient world to a mass audience, and has written and presented TV series on the BBC, ITV, History Channel and National Geographic. We discussed why the study of arts and humanities, in particular history, is more vital than ever today and why these disciplines so often lose out to STEM in the eyes of policymakers and what can be done to change this. Now, I feel I should disclose here, I am myself a history graduate and Eliza studied English literature, so it perhaps could not be said that we are entirely impartial, but despite knowing that the arts and humanities have huge value, I've not always been able to articulate exactly why. And these two guests make this case really persuasively with great clarity, so well worth a listen. Let's start with Michael. Hi Michael, welcome to Campus Talks.
Hi Miranda, thanks so much indeed for having me.
given the season, are you feeling ready for your Christmas break? Are the decorations up, the food on order?
The decorations are up. I have a 2-year-old son, so we're at that funny age where he knows something's happening, but not quite yet kind of tuned into all of the intricacies of Christmas. So it's a nice sort of balance between being able to be festive, but not having to go through necessarily all of the cultural traditions just yet.
Yeah, that's interesting. I also have a 2-year-old son, so I can relate to all of that. However, we're not here to talk about Christmas or indeed our toddlers. We are here to explore the importance or value, if you like, of the arts and humanities at a time when these disciplines feel somewhat sidelined, certainly by government. And of course, that has a knock-on effect on funding and arguably the public perception or student perceptions of arts and humanities courses. However, this is nothing new. Even a small amount of reading on this subject will show this is a somewhat perennial problem for these disciplines. Now, you are an ancient historian and classicist, so since one of the ongoing challenges posed by those who would have classics consigned to history, excuse the pun, is so what? Why should we care? What's the relevance of these topics? So to answer that, let's start with your own story, because clearly for you there was a so what, and thus I'm interested, what drew you to the classics?
So for me, classics was not always going to be the option, the pathway, the career choice by any means, shape, or form. I went through, I think, what many students and school pupils go through, which is a vast smorgasbord of different interests. I remember thinking I was going to be a doctor at one point. I was going to be a lawyer. I don't think I had the astronaut phase, but eventually it really was a sort of chance encounter with a bit of ancient Greek one day that I sort of went, oh, I just find that interesting. And I think utterly crucial to whatever one chooses to do in life, it has to be something you find interesting and fulfilling. There has to be a passion, there has to be a drive, and that can be discovered in all sorts of ways by people. And then when I was 17, I ended up going to Greece on a school trip and absolutely fell in love with being in the locations, in the ancient sites, that lived experience of being within an ancient society that I was trying to get at and work out what made it tick. And for me, the best way of explaining kind of classics and my interest in it as a subject is it's kind of sociology. It's sociology just on a society that happened to exist 2,500 years ago in the ancient Greek case. And so we're having to use particular tools and particular methods to be able to get at that question of what makes that society tick, how does it work? And it's the multiplicity of the subject as a result, the different angles you take, the different kinds of evidence you have to deal with, the different sorts of questions you ask, that has kept me interested and passionate about it as a subject and has constantly kept it relevant to me and to the life I lead in the modern world 2,500 years later, because asking those questions of a society that existed in the past are very, very helpful. The answers you come up with and the questions that you ask are immediately relevant, of course, to the society we also live in today. And they provide a great foil, a great contrast, and a great set of ways into understanding the world we also live in today.
That's a fantastic argument for why school trips and those direct experiences are so important and so powerful. You mentioned that by studying history, you learn a lot about contemporary life. Can you expand on that a little to just really break down how a subject like history, from ancient to modern, brings benefits, not just for those who study it, but to society more broadly?
I think there are a number of different benefits that studying the past, whatever period of the past and whatever place of the past that might be, bring to how people then engage with, interact, and contribute to the modern world around us. The first is that the world we live in now did not just appear. It comes from somewhere. It comes from the past. And the way in which our world works today cannot be understood without understanding where it has come from and what previous generations that have walked these these spaces before us have chosen to do, how they've chosen to think, and what they've chosen to create and leave for us as the framework in which we then operate and we then make our own choices. So understanding the past fundamentally helps us understand the present. It couldn't be otherwise. It gives us a depth and a richness to our understanding of the world in which we live. But on top of that, I think it also gives us a sense of the options tried, what's worked, what hasn't worked in the past. And I know famously that, that people talk about the fact we don't learn from history. As a human race, we're not very good at learning from our past mistakes. And that is, of course, true, right? But at the same time, there is an element here in which a study of the past helps us understand what might be a better option to try when we are faced with some of the challenges that we are faced with in the future. I think there's two other elements. One is very particular to my field in the study of the Greek and Roman worlds, and to any other field of history which is constantly brought into play. And we notice this kind of particularly with the Greeks and Romans, pretty much everywhere we look around. They may be dead and gone a long time ago, but we are constantly still using exemplar from their world and surrounding ourselves with exemplar from their world, oftentimes in many ways as justifications for our current and future actions. And in that case, what we often see is that there's both a use and a misuse, an abuse of the past, a recalibration of what the past looks like in order to fit the current and future kind of desire that someone is trying to justify as an action. And in that case, I think there's a very particular role for historians to play, which is really calling out where there is a misuse and abuse of an understanding of the past in order to try to justify a particular course of action in the future. And the final thing I would say, and again, I feel this very strongly in relation to the study of the Greeks and Romans, it goes back to that understanding what made them tick as a culture and the sorts of answers they came up with to questions that are still ultimately relevant today. What is justice? What is fairness? What is equality? What is love? What is all of these sorts of questions? But crucially, the answers they came up with, we may not like them. We may not agree with them. They may not be what we want to embrace today at all. They often aren't. But crucially, the study of those cultures keeps the ground uncertain beneath our feet. And one of the things that I worry about more than anything is that people don't question enough the world in which they live and the assumptions they make and the assumptions that are made in the world around them. And if there is a role for the study of the past in the future, for me, more than anything, it is about keeping the ground uncertain beneath our feet and keeping us questioning the assumptions by which we live and by which we make our decisions. Because that process of questioning will, I think, inevitably lead us to better decisions in the future.
Yes, well, that is a very convincing case made for studying history. I mean, that last point, that really underlines one of the core skills that is underpinned by studying a subject like history, is that critiquing of what is going on around you in a more acute way. I just want to touch on a few of the points that you've highlighted there. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the common claim that we never learn from the past. There are examples that you can point to that suggest that's the case, but I'd say humanity overall, there is also huge evidence of progress in all sorts of ways. It's just that it's not obviously a linear trajectory. But I think one of the key points I'd take away from everything you've said there is that the reason history seems so important is that, of course, that humans themselves don't change. So the environment around them may change hugely, but actually the way they respond to things and the fundamentals of humanity don't hugely change. And that means that the decisions that are made in the past are still mirrored and therefore can educate us greatly in how we are potentially likely to respond to things, even if it's not ideally how we should respond to things. Do you think that's fair?
I think in many ways that is absolutely fair. I mean, one prime example, again, just from my field, is ancient Greek drama, and particularly ancient Greek tragedy. There's a reason these plays are still being performed and received very, very well 2,500 years later. And it is because most often what at the heart of every one of these tragedies is a key moral question, which still is an absolutely central moral question to the human race, to humanity, and to how we live our lives today. We may not want to take the option that they would have taken and did take in the ancient tragedies and approved of in ancient Greek culture. We may have a different answer today, but the question and the process and the dilemma that they are being faced with is the same then as it is now. So I think that similarity is absolutely crucial. But I also think the difference is absolutely crucial, where we want to see the distance. And this goes back to that other point I was making around how we often reshape the past to support our present. One of the other kind of phrases I love about related to history is only the future is certain, the past just keeps on changing. And I think that's because we do rewrite our pasts all the time. We do it at individual personal levels, we do it at societal levels, we do it at human race levels. And as a result, that there is an understanding of that process. It's a natural part of the human condition, and we can and we should do that, right? We shouldn't make the past immutable in any kind of way, but also calling out where there is a restructuring of the past to service the present, I think is absolutely essential, particularly in the era in which we now live, where facts are not as perhaps readily clear as they once were, if indeed they ever were. But right now, there is a real need also for calling out difference as much as similarity, and calling out fact from a recalibration and a reworking of the past to suit the present.
Yes, you beat me to it, but I was going to say precisely that the need for specialists who are able, from a well-researched point of view with a really critical lens, to call out or question biased interpretations of the past, and thus indeed justifying the future, feels more important now than ever. And the other thing you mentioned just in your top line arguments for why this is also important is the fact that in the past we can look to decisions that were made and potentially learn from them and make different decisions. If you view it like that, the whole of history is like one giant field experiment from which we are still learning. Taking all of that into account, I'm really interested. What transformation do you observe when students immerse themselves in, for instance, ancient history?
So when students immerse themselves, I mean, the development that we see is very much in their critical thinking. How do they actually take the different sources that are presented to them, weigh them up to try to get to the closest possible resemblance of fact, of truth about what this society was like? But also alongside that, the development of empathy. Because what we're asking them to do is imagine themselves back in a world which is entirely alien to their own that they live in today, and to understand from multiple perspectives, multiple different viewpoints that existed then, just as multiple different viewpoints of the world exist now, of what made that place tick. And you can't do that without putting yourself in the shoes of the people who walked then, or not necessarily shoes, sandals, kind of in the ancient Greek and Roman case. So empathy and critical thinking, alongside analysis, but also creativity. We're not suggesting that kind of graduates of the history make stuff up. It's not that kind of creativity, but it is creativity in terms of working out the questions that need to be asked to fill the gaps. And where the evidence, in our case, in the Greek and Roman world, there are great gaps in the evidence. What can we do to fill those gaps? Where can we look to perhaps provide a bridge when simply the evidence has not survived? And what kind of fields of study can we look to in order to bring to bear to help bridge those gaps? So creativity, empathy, critical thinking, analysis. And then the final point, I would say that increasingly, we certainly at the University of Warwick are building into our programs is how our students can then communicate and engage with others about their knowledge, their understanding, their findings, and their thoughts. And this, I think, is utterly critical. And it goes back to that point around how do we make the study of these subjects useful to the modern world? They cannot sit in ivory towers in dusty volumes and tomes about the past. The past is only useful if it is a part of a dialogue with the present. And to have that dialogue, particularly in the places and in the arenas that it needs to be had now, which is more in the public domain, in the media domain, on social media, and kind of, again, at political and governmental and national and international levels, it is essential that our students are able to communicate and engage people both with a knowledge of the subject and those who are coming to it from an entirely different background. So for us, it's that's how I would sum it up. It's about critical thinking and analysis. It's about empathy and creativity, and then it's about communication and engagement.
Yes. I'm going to steal that quote, actually, Michael. The past is only useful if it is in dialogue with the present. I think that's a very powerful sentence. But I mean, all the skills you've pointed to there that students are developing through these studies are among the most in-demand skills cited by employers, by the World Economic Forum, by anyone who is collating skills demands, skills gaps, and so on. So then, given everything that you've said, both on what the students are gaining, but also the wider importance of these subjects, why do you think history and indeed the arts and humanities more generally have such trouble persuading policymakers of their value? Because this has been going on quite a long time. Like, what sits at the heart of that?
I think one element of what sits at the heart of this problem is the sense of immediate return and clear path. It is very easy, I think, to see what is the outcome of scientific discovery and research, whether that be in terms of the invention of a new tool or a new technology or of a new drug or of a new vaccine or a new format of care. So there is an immediacy to the outcome, the input and the output. What we've been talking about in terms of the skill sets that come with studies from particularly a historical background, but I would argue more widely across the arts and humanities, are a set of skills that are ever present and ever needed, but not necessarily the headline of the story. And we've been talking about the ability to take on critical thinking, analysis, creativity, empathy, adaptability. It is those sorts of skills that create the environments, the questions, and the need, the urges, the desire, the push, if you like, towards some of those big headline grabbing inventions and discoveries, and enable them to then be used in sensible and thoughtful ways that really, I think, are at the heart of what arts and humanities bring to the table. But it is hard to argue for that when study is reduced to statistics, and when study is reduced to pounds and pence. But you are absolutely right, that when you see all of the latest surveys that have done. So, the UUK did a survey recently of FTSE 350 listed companies. And what comes out of that, crucially, is none of the leaders of these companies see a future for the big technological inventions. And in particular, this recent survey with the UK was thinking about AI, of course, which is the big disruptor coming to change the work world and the world more widely. None of them see a future for it without there being alongside that the creative thinkers, the critical thinkers, and those who are able to actually help make sense of and give value to and help businesses adapt to what disruption that, in this case, particularly AI will bring. So when we look at what people in business are saying, and in a wide range of industries, they see this need for both of these sets of the skills, both the ability to bring the inventions, the discoveries, and the technological changes, but equally the need for the people who can bring the skills that will allow both the industries themselves and society as a whole to adapt to those new changes and make the best use of them.
Yes, yeah, I have to say, you don't necessarily have to speak to someone in the arts and humanities to get a defense of them in that context. I have spoken to a number of STEM academics who will point out that actually the barriers to a lot of solutions are not technical, they're human. The technical solution is available. It's trying to get it rolled out, used, applied effectively that is the major challenge. And of course, as you've just described, that is where arts and humanities scholars and students and those who have engaged in those topics to really kind of question what makes us human, how we understand, communicate the world, can help. They can help with that.
I would absolutely agree. I mean, I don't think, though, this leads us down the road of saying that we should just integrate some study of arts and humanities into STEM subjects, or that you can only have the study of an arts and humanities subject in combination with a STEM subject, as many have argued. I see them as complementary and essential bedfellows with one another. But actually, I think it's extremely important that the generation or the creation of these two kinds of knowledge, experience, understanding, and skill sets are in some ways kept separate, because it's that positive clash of the two. It's the dialogue that is created between the two that, as you say, produces the kinds of solutions that allows us to not only create the technologies of the future, but then actually create the contexts in which they can be properly, safely, and helpfully used.
Yes, yeah, that's a really important point, actually. You don't want one to be subsumed by the other, but also by keeping them separate, it will bring genuinely fresh perspectives on these issues from kind of either side of that divide. I mean, coming back to the many vital skills that can be accrued by studying history and indeed many other disciplines sitting under the arts and humanities umbrella. And I keep using that term. And of course, within it, there's a vast array of different specialisms. But for the sake of this podcast, I will continue to refer to the arts and humanities. Given that the outputs are less tangible and arguably less quantifiable in a very data-obsessed world, how do you think academics working in these disciplines and indeed their institutions might try to change the policymaker perspective? What other tools might be at your disposal to demonstrate the value?
So I would start with going back to that point around the important nature of the skills that we've identified. Because I think any degree program needs to be able to clearly show how it equips the student undertaking that program of study, not just with the knowledge that comes from that studying that particular subject, whatever it might be, but the set of skills that they will then be able to take on with them. And that is where I think there is a real challenge for universities and for departments within the arts and humanities, is how to really foreground the skills that come out of studying a particular topic. So, we've talked about critical thinking and analysis, we've talked about creativity and empathy, communication and engagement. It is that ability to connect knowledge, capability, and purpose, that ability to handle complexity, that ability then to be adaptable to a changing environment, that really, I think, is where arts and humanities graduates excel. And how do we make those more visible within a degree program? I think we do that partly by building in to the degree programs a more applied nature of skills learnt, or the ability to apply those skills as part of the degree program. I would like to see lots more study kind of linked with internship application Equally with the study of public engagement, I mean, this has been very, very close to my heart throughout my career. But going back to that communication and engagement piece, that the knowledge is useless unless it's in dialogue with the society to which it hopefully is going to provide some support and help. So how one does that and the ability to do that and to do it well, I think is something we take for granted and we shouldn't do, because it's actually quite a difficult thing to do and needs to be part and parcel of the way we teach and how people learn. But I think the other element to it is understanding what government does see, which is, there was a Skills England report came out this year on sector evidence and growth skills offer, and what they underlined is that actually it's going to be the transferable employment skills that will be the skills in greatest demand across the labour market come 2035. The ability to withstand change. Change is going to be ever more present. There will be even more disruptions to the workplace and to what careers look like and what professions look like as technologies come in and change. AI is the one we're looking at, obviously, with a fundamental eye at the moment. But the ability to adapt and to continue to adapt and to be able to transfer and to move and to relearn and to rethink how a world works and how a particular career or industry or profession works is going to be essential within a labour market that will be constantly in transition and at the same time constantly international and global in a way that perhaps we can still only glimpse at. So all of
Yes.
those things come together to put a challenge to those in universities to make degree courses really showcase the skills that the student will come out with alongside the knowledge they will come out with, and to ensure that the student has had the chance to apply those knowledge and those skills as part of their degree learning, so that they are ready from day one to know the value they bring to the table.
Yes, because presumably in allowing them to apply those skills, you're helping them simply recognize the skills they've gained.
Yeah, I absolutely think that, there's been other studies that look at, arts and humanities graduates, and one of the things I think is actually a huge positive is arts and humanities graduates are more likely to pursue further study than any other field, and that's, I would say, a recognition of the fact that they have a sense of what they don't know. And it comes back to that point about the arts and humanities, keeping the ground uncertain beneath our feet, keeping us questioning, not just accepting our assumptions, that there is more to know, there is more to question, there is more to think about. And the other thing those same reports point to is that arts and humanities graduates bring with them a stronger sense of purpose in many ways, or bring or desire a stronger sense of purpose kind of within their career and within their profession. And I think that's an absolutely crucial thing, because it's about purpose and it's about direction, whatever career, whatever industry, whatever profession it might be, that is what's going to drive change and development. So I think those are two other elements that arts and humanities graduates bring alongside all of the critical analysis and critical thinking and creativity and empathy and communication and engagement and adaptability that we've spoken about.
Yes, and your point that there's research to show arts and humanities graduates, seek purpose. I think that's demonstrative of what a blunt instrument graduate earnings can be to test successful outcomes, because there are fantastically fulfilling jobs that aren't associated with particularly high salaries, certainly not at the starting level. Pivoting slightly, you've been a driving force behind widening participation programs. I know there was an initiative in Coventry focused on the classics. What have you learned really works in capturing the imaginations of school pupils when trying to engage them in this subject?
Well, I start with my own experience, which was perhaps, as I said, not only not necessarily being interested in the classics, but actually positively disliking part of the study of Latin I did. And back in my day in school, it was that old learn by rote, quote your Moa Mathematic, and kind of all these dry textbooks that were teaching you grammar, etc. and now I supplement that with obviously long experience of going into schools and standing in front of them. My hat goes off to teachers across the UK, because there is and indeed the world, because there is no more terrifying experience, I think, than standing in front of a group of young people and trying to make something relevant to them and to their worlds and to their learning. For me, what works in relation to the study of particularly ancient Greece and Rome is about giving a sense of that lived experience. So it goes back to the original point we were talking about, which is kind of, this is about a society. This is about a bunch of people who created something and lived an everyday, and to the worth and wonder that for me was experienced when I first went to stand in some of the remaining sites of the ancient world. Nowadays, technology obviously allows us to do that in all sorts of ways, whether that's through virtual reality, or whether it's through video games. A lot of people come to study classics because they've been playing Assassin's Creed Odyssey and getting into kind of a lived experience of the ancient world that way, or reading the Percy Jackson books or whatever it might be, making it real, making it something that they can identify and put themselves in the shoes, the sandals of whoever was there, and understanding some of the decisions that were made. The crucial thing, though, I think, on top of that, and it goes back to something you said at the very beginning of this interview, the so what. The so what. Yes, okay, so we can learn about some fascinating facts and ways in which this crazy society lived, 2,500 years ago. So what? What do they take away from that? What does that make them think about when they go out to in the school world, into the school playground, or when they go home at the end of the day, or when they face some of the challenges they will face, as they grow up? That so what, for me, is an essential part of what any lesson about the history, and particularly in my case, the history of the Greeks and Romans, should be about.
And in a similar vein, you've done a lot of media and public engagement work, TV broadcasting and so on. How do you think your training as a historian has helped with this?
I would say it's a much more two-way process of improvement, actually. So I came to doing public engagement across books, across TV, radio, podcasts, social media, because I saw it as a fundamentally important thing. That if I thought this was an important enough subject to dedicate my life to studying, then I should be spending a good deal of my time explaining why I thought it was so important and what the relevance of it was to the wider world. It comes back to that so what question. So, fundamentally, kind of obviously the skills you develop as a historian, we talked about critical thinking, analysis, creativity, and empathy. Those are all kind of helpful skills in order to be able to create an answer to the so what that you then want to communicate out more widely. But actually doing that process of communication and engagement with a much, much wider world who don't spend their days thinking about the ancient Greeks and Romans and have very different lives, and whom you have to sort of find a way to make what you want to say about the ancient Greeks and Romans relevant to them in their daily lives. That set of skills, actually, I've found has paid back huge dividends within my university career world. I think it's made me a better teacher of the students who come to the university. It's made me a better researcher, because very often the questions I now bring back to my research in the world have been generated and come out of discussions I've had kind of actually within the public engagement world, because it's broadened my horizons of the questions that I need to be asking. And I think it as a result, enabled me to be an all-round better engager with the past, whether that's as researcher, whether that's as teacher, or whether that's as communicator and being part of the dialogue between the past and the present, and being between study of the past and public engagement and use of the past in wider society.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Look, Michael, it's been a delight to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
I feel few people could explain in such clear and accessible terms why it is that we should care about the past, but also invest in all the diverse and rich subjects that fall within the bracket of arts and humanities. I was also struck by Michael's point that While different disciplines have much to gain by working together and drawing on one another's expertise, we must be careful to preserve the arts and humanities as standalone specialisms in order to preserve that very diversity of perspectives that they can bring. So I guess to summarise, to reap the benefits of interdisciplinarity, we need to ensure all the disciplines themselves are flourishing. Now, over to Eliza and Mark to expand further on why interdisciplinarity itself can be so powerful and the role that the arts and humanities can play in this.
Hi Mark, and welcome to the Campus Talks podcast.
Hi, good to see you.
We are going to be talking about the arts and humanities and the value thereof today, something that I think you know quite a bit about because as a fine arts graduate, your background is in the arts and humanities. And so to start us off, I wondered if you could tell us what role you think that early training has played in your career from the very beginning, from being the studio technician right the way through to your current position as vice-chancellor at Liverpool John Moores University.
Perhaps if I go back historically to my first role at what was then Liverpool Polytechnic. So having gained my degree in fine art up at Lancaster College of Art, it was a very interesting sort of decision on my part, I thought. Having travelled back to Liverpool with the intention of not staying very long, I then came across a role at Liverpool Polytechnic in the fine art department. And it was a role managing a small group of technicians. And that was an area that I thought I had a very good grounding in, because one thing I'll say about my arts education, whilst there was obviously the support around the critical thinking, around the creativity, there was also that very much a sort of a technical underpinning. So understanding how to make my own paper, understanding how to build a canvas stretch the canvas. That gave me an opportunity to work in the art school for a number of years. So I think the skills that I'd learned, both in terms of those very technical skills, but perhaps the creativity and problem solving side, as it's described, again, sort of helped me develop my career. And over a number of years, I think I've taken the learning, the understanding, the study of art history and that sort of cultural literacy, if you can describe it in that way, and taking those skills into every single role that I've had, I think, over that period of time. And, you know, aligned to that was always perhaps a sort of a business acumen. So I did establish my own gallery and picture framing business outside of the university at the time. And I think with the combination of the business acumen skills, the creativity, the problem solving, that sort of critical thinking, that was something I think that gave me a very good grounding and provided me with the skills that I think that I've needed over what's been a very long career here at Liverpool John Moores University.
Yes, you've been at Liverpool John Moores since 1981, I think, isn't it? Since 44 years now?
Literally just celebrated my 44th anniversary here. Yes.
Oh, that is an amazing run. So you mentioned in your description there of how the arts and humanities and those various skills have shaped you. And it's well established that these disciplines also set students up with valuable skills like critical thinking and creativity and things. And yet it feels like this message doesn't necessarily get through. Do you think that these disciplines have a bit of a public image problem?
I don't think that there is a strong supportive narrative around the value of arts and humanities subjects. However, evidence is very clear. 80% of employers are discipline agnostic. What they're looking for are a set of skills. And I think what is evident is that arts and humanities graduates can clearly demonstrate the sorts of skills we described around critical thinking, communication, in many cases, resilience, the ability to be adaptable, that sort of creativity and problem solving. So there's a whole range, I think, of very, very valuable skills that employers have high on their list of priorities. The technical skills in many jobs you can learn on the job. It's having the ability, I think, to have those, let's call them foundation skills, to have those skills to be able to contribute constructively and creatively to a workplace. So having said that, I don't think what we do particularly well is to actually use role models of people that have come through an arts and humanities background who've then gone on to have very different careers. So, I'm obviously one example, but I'm sure there are many other and probably better examples of people that have gone through that particular degree program and then gone into a whole range of very exciting and interesting careers. I think what we also need to do is to be work very much with students to talk to them about the types of careers they could go into, but in a very, very broad sense, and not have it narrowly focused upon some of the very obvious skills that a graduate could go into. In a STEM subject and some other subjects, there's probably a more obvious connection between the subject of the degree and the employment opportunities. It's probably less obvious in arts and humanities in many cases. So it's therefore using that sort of skill set to be able to articulate and demonstrate the sort of roles that people can move into. I mean, I think we've had a recent government where more than half the cabinet studied PPE at Oxford or Cambridge. Very good example of where the humanities can be used for a different type of career.
Yeah, absolutely. And I saw a New York Times story recently, I think, that quoted figures that the art history graduates' unemployment rate was actually half of that of computer science and computer engineers majors, which I thought was interesting, and as an arts graduate myself, gratifying in a strange kind of way. I wondered whether then perhaps the disciplines need to get better at articulating their own particular strengths and values. I mean, we're talking very broadly about arts and humanities, but obviously within that, there's huge differences between the disciplines that we're talking about, and each brings their own strengths and their own particular kind of skill sets.
I mean, they do. In the broad sense, if we look at subjects, for example, English literature, that is a route way into many different careers, whether that be sort of marketing or law. Actually, I mean, it could be the abilities that are and the skills that are developed as part of an English program around sort of close reading, communication, the strong written and verbal skills are particularly important there for somebody perhaps in the law sector. I think the creative industries are slightly different in that sense, and many of the creative industries, certainly, graduates go into self-employment. They're working within that sort of economy, which again is very, very strong. If I look where we are located in Liverpool City region's creative industries are of huge value to the local economy. And it is seen as an area of further development to further enhance the Liverpool City region. And that's true of a number of other sectors. I mean, you can see nationally the value of the creative industries to the UK PLC, however you want to describe it. So I think we have a really important job to do to articulate much more clearly, and I think with a very sound evidence base, that studying for those degrees is of an equivalent value to any other more vocational, shall we say, degree.
I want to dig into one of your success stories actually and use it to pivot to the idea of interdisciplinarity and how arts and humanities contribute to that. So, Liverpool John Moores was one of 19 UK institutions recognised last month in the Queen Elizabeth Prizes for further and higher education for its work in facial identity and representation for FaceLab. So I am reading here. I do not pretend to understand this science. The work of FaceLab has been described as innovative craniofacial projects in forensic identification and digital heritage, advancing interdisciplinary research and knowledge exchange in heritage, arts, culture, and forensic investigation. What I do know is that their work in constructing what historical figures would have looked like is completely remarkable. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, about how humanities skills contribute to interdisciplinary work.
I mean, certainly that's a very good example of where art and science come together in a way that produces a discipline born out of those interdisciplinary skills. So I think, one of their major success stories, for example, in FaceLab was recreating the face of Richard II. So, using the sort of the skull fragments, the skull pieces, then overlaying that using part sort of medical understanding of facial construction, but then overlaying that with this sort of the artistic picture of what the face might actually look like. They've done that successfully in a number of areas. Richard II just being one of, I guess, one of the more sort of high-profile ones. But the work that they do in that sort of craniofacial recognition is a really important area of research. But it does require having a group of colleagues with a very wide range of skills and bringing them together in a way, and the way they do operate as a team with absolute total mutual respect for each other's contribution to the discipline. And I think there is also an MSc there in art and science that brings together in a very sort of formal academic way that those two different interdisciplinary skill sets.
It seems like this kind of work really underpins the need to maintain very strong foundational work, certainly across humanities like history, archaeology. They all come together and play their important part. There was another quite good example, actually, I read about this week. It was a letter in the Times in response to the obituary for Tom Stoppard, who died last month.
Yeah.
And one of the emeritus professors of surgery at UCL actually wrote, and I don't know if you saw this letter, he was talking about going to see Arcadia, and in it, Stoppard explains chaos theory using the metaphor of flowers. And in watching the play, Professor Bohm, I think it led to a progress in ideas about how breast cancer was understood and about the breast the progression of breast cancer. And it just seemed to me like such a good example of expertise being passed from science to the arts and back again. I was just really struck by that example and just wondered whether you had seen that sort of thinking in action as well yourself.
Yeah, we've certainly seen some of those examples. I mean, there is a piece of work that the university is heavily involved in terms of the work that we undertake in endoscopy. And that has taken, again, it goes back to the sort of the art and science piece of taking and translating into a sort of a digital format different types of tumours, but actually the way they're designed is undertaken by the sort of the creative and the art side of the team, but the way that they're utilised in terms of the training for consultants and surgeons, for example, is quite different, because that is obviously using the output from that very sort of creative digitization of what's quite clearly a very sort of dramatic illness, and ensuring that as a university we're producing the educational environment that enables us to train the consultants and the surgeons of the future.
Have you seen those kinds of environments evolve and change in your time at John Moores?
I've certainly seen the more sort of collaborative, collegiate, interdisciplinary work develop quite significantly. I mean, some of that I've taken a very purposeful decision at the university. We now operate only a 2-faculty model, which is designed for a number of reasons, not least to break down some of the disciplinary silos and bringing colleagues together in a way where they can have the open conversations, particularly where areas of academic discipline sort of overlap, and develop new parts to the portfolio, as well as some new areas of thinking around research. So I think that again is helpful. 2 faculties having a conversation is much easier than 5 faculties having a conversation.
So you just have 2 faculties in total in the university?
Two faculties.
And so what are they? What are they called?
We have one faculty called Society and Culture, and one faculty called the Faculty of Health, Innovation, Technology and Science.
Right. Wow. Yeah. Well, I guess that would really facilitate conversations in between the disciplines. And how long's that structure been in place?
It's been in place for just over 12 months now, but we're already seeing some of the very positive benefits that I'd hoped we'd see with the nature of those sort of wide-ranging, again, interdisciplinary conversations that are now taking place, without having, as I say, perhaps some of the risks around silo mentality and thinking and culture that can often happen when there's, we did move from a 5 to a 2 faculty model.
That's a really big change. Just to play devil's advocate for a second, is there a danger in making a change like that to bring more disciplines together under the same umbrella? Is there a danger to individual disciplines? So how do you keep your discipline expertise strong and not diluted by those interchanges that are so valuable in themselves, obviously?
Within the faculty, there are the academic schools, and each school has its own academic discipline. So it's the level beneath the faculty that has that strength and definition around the academic discipline. What the faculty does, almost act as a convener and grant permission for people to have those conversations in a very sort of open and frank way.
As we have mentioned, you've been at Liverpool John Moores for a while. And your path has not been typical, I don't think. As a teenager growing up in inner city Liverpool, so you are Liverpool born and bred, as I understand it, you wanted to be an artist, and you're still a practicing artist. And I wondered what advice you would give to yourself if you were a fine arts graduate now.
Don't impose any self barriers. Don't impose constraints on yourself. Just be open and willing to take on challenges and experiences. And also, if the opportunity of mentorship comes along, always take it. I mean, advice and support is invaluable. You always have the personal choice whether to accept it or not, but to have it there, I think, is particularly important. And certainly over the period of my career, there are at least sort of 5 or 6 individuals who I think have played a very significant part in supporting me to develop, a skill set which I'd like to think aligns to the role of a vice-chancellor.
Well, you've been in the chair since 2021, and so yes, it seems like things are travelling very well. Outside of your work, you are still a practicing artist, and just as a final question, I wanted to know what that practice brings to your life.
It brings to my life a number of things. So my wife Elaine is also a practicing artist. So there's very much a sort of a shared interest there. But it gives me an opportunity, I think, to step out from the role, whether that just be on a holiday where we'll go and sit on a beach, draw and paint, and or walk up into various landscapes and just take an opportunity to sit with a sketchbook. Just having the ability to completely switch off, no mobile phone, and just engage with the landscape in a way that I just find actually very regenerative in that sense. I do use the word therapy, and it works exceptionally well as a therapeutic pastime.
Well, I think that is a very calm note for us to end the interview on. So thank you so much for your time today, Mark. It's been really great speaking to you.
Thank you.
Fantastic. It's interesting how much those core and massively sought after skills actually came out of both interviews as being really the major selling point of the arts and humanities disciplines, because there is no doubt that employers and indeed government are clamouring for graduates with analytical, critical thinking, creativity, problem solving skills, the ability to adapt and so on. I also was really interested by the fact that, slightly to my surprise, when asked what he felt that his background as an artist had brought to his work within the university, Mark pointed to his business acumen. It's something that is often overlooked, I would say, as an attribute of those working within the arts or creatives. Of course, to actually make a success of a career or a business in art, that is very difficult, and to do well in that you certainly do need extremely good business acumen. So I think that's a really pertinent point. If you would like to read more insights and thoughts, advice from academics and others in higher education making the case for these disciplines, but also providing tips on how to really prove that value and demonstrate it and harness it, we have a whole collection dedicated to this on campus. It's a spotlight guide called Making the Case for Arts and Humanities, and you will find that at www.timeshighereducation.com/campus. If you enjoyed the podcast, please do like and subscribe, and we will be back with you in 2026. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.